Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Lynn Patten. I'm the Chief Exec of NHS Clinical Commissioners, and I'm also the Director of the ICS network at the NHS Confederation. So welcome to this joint NHS Providers and NHSCC event. This is a follow-up to our joint event on provider collaboratives and strategic commissioning that we held in March, which generated some amazing, really rich discussion, and it was massively oversubscribed. So today this is an opportunity to continue that conversation with some really exciting and different case studies that we've got today. So what an important day today is. We understand that the bill will be published today. So we'll have all our teams at NHS Providers and the Confederation scrabbling around to try and make sense of what that is for our members and for you all today. But on this day, I think it's important for us to say that both the NHS Confederation and NHS Providers generally support the direction of travel to enable integrated care systems and, importantly, to enable provider collaboration within the structure of integrated care systems. We've seen multiple examples of this already happening amongst our members, where providers are being enabled, empowered to innovate and deliver change at that system level and at place level too. Now, we have both as organisations previously urged NHSCI to embrace a much more flexible and permissive approach to the development of provider collaboratives that needs to work with all the different systems and geographies that we have throughout the very varied integrated care systems that we have. And we understand that the revised guidance document does enable providers to work into collaborative models at place, at system, and beyond ICSs at region and super region as well. So that, again, we do welcome. And I think we also welcome that there's a recognition that it's about a broader range of providers. It's not just about our acute trusts. And that includes community providers, ambulance services, and specialist trusts. However, we do express some caution around the mandatory nature of the provider collaboratives. That could just create a sort of tick box exercise that people sort of say, well, we've got one, we'll do that, we'll move on. And actually that may potentially stifle rather than really facilitate that true innovation. And we continue to urge NHS England and the regional teams to continue to adopt a permissive approach to how these develop, so that genuinely there is that permissive nature both at place and system level that enables providers to lead that development. So there's various questions about the resources and the development of provider collaboratives remain unanswered, and we continue to lobby to make sure that there is as little tension as possible going forward as we see all this develop. So we've got some great speakers today. I'm just going to briefly introduce them, and then we'll move on to some housekeeping. So today we've got Sharon Pickering starting us off with the first case study. Sharon is the Director of Planning, Performance and Communication at Tees, Esk and Wear Valleys NHS Trust, which is part of the North Eastern Cumbria ICS Mental Health Provider Collaborative. The second case study we've got a number of speakers. We've got Carly West-Burnham, Director of Strategy at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in King's Lynn. We've got John Barber, Director of Strategy and Integration at the James Paget University Hospitals FT. Jim Barker, Head of Strategy at the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospitals FT, also with us. And finally, Melanie Craig, the Chief Officer of Norfolk and Waveney ECG, which is part of the Norfolk and Waveney ICS Acute Provider Collaborative. They're going to give us some insight into our second case study today. So just be aware the meeting is being recorded, and make sure that you have your microphones on mute during the presentations, please, out of respect to our presenters today. Do put your questions in the chat box throughout. There will be dedicated questions at the end, time for Q&A at the end, and my team will be prompting me if I have missed your chat, if your question's in the chat. If you do want to ask your question audibly, do raise your hand through the hand function. If you can't, just wave and I'll try and see you, or one of the team will tell us that you're waving madly at me and that you want to come in with your point. So, without further ado then, I'd like to hand over to Sharon, who's going to present to us our first case study from Tees, Esk and Wear Valleys. Welcome, Sharon, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lou. So if we could just have the presentation, please. Thanks, Nikki. So as Lou said, I'm Sharon Pickering. I'm a director in Tees, Esk and Wear Valleys, which is a mental health trust up in the northeast. And together with our colleagues in a neighbouring trust, Cumbria, Northumberland and Tyne and Wear FT, we are part of the North East and North Cumbria Mental Health, Learning Disability and Autism Partnership. Could you have the next slide, please? So in terms of what we are, as it says on the slide, we are a particular type of provider collaborative that was established by NHS England some time ago now, that actually is responsible for the commissioning of these specialised services across the footprint. So the specialised services commissioning that was once done by NHS England under the Lansley reforms have now been transferred into our partnership for these three services. As I've said, we're made up of CNTW and ourselves, and we were formally established as a provider collaborative in April just gone, the 1st of April. However, we've been working in this way since 2017 under what were then called the new care models for specialised services, which were really the predecessors, the precursors to provider collaboratives. So in 2017, we created the partnership between ourselves, and that was made up of two children's and young people's new care models, one that was led by CNTW and one that was led by ourselves, and a adult secure new care model that was led by TUV. Just to note though, now we've moved to a provider collaborative, all of those three provider collaboratives are led by CNTW. They are the lead provider, and they have the lead contract with NHS England to transfer the commissioning budgets into the provider. But we were really, really clear that actually there has to be a lead provider to enact that transfer of the commissioning budget. But actually, if you came and sat in with us, you would not really notice that there is such a thing as lead provider, because we do everything together. And in fact, you know, I'm here giving this presentation because my colleague Lisa Quinn is on holiday this week, and you know, she stands in for me, I stand in for her. We just manage that between us. So it really is a partnership approach. And whilst CNTW are the lead, it is the chief executive TUV that chairs the partnership board. So again, that just shows how we're trying to make sure that it feels like a true partnership, and we work in that way. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is what we're trying to do. So we're set up, and our ambition is to redesign pathways of care that do these things. And really the whole purpose of the new care models was exactly the same. And it was really trying to overcome the fracture that in effect the Lansley reforms had introduced into that commission of entire pathways. And of course, NHS England were not, specialised commissioners were not able to use their specialised commissioning budgets on non-specialised services, but the new care models were, as are the provider collaborative. So prior to the establishment of the provider collaborative, as an example, in the one of the new care models, the children one that existed before the provider collaborative, we invested significantly in community services by making savings in the reduction of the use of beds. So we reduced over the lifetime of our new care models the number of children that were accessing beds from about 42 that were in the cohort when we started to round about 20, 25, and we could use that money to reinvest in the pathway. Our total commissioning budget for the three services is 86 million, And our responsibilities include all of the commissioning cycle, you know, the needs assessment, the planning, you know, procurement, contract management, you know, including quality governance, etc. So we really have taken on that responsibility from NHS England, who did this before. Could I have the next slide, please? So I just want to talk about the if we can just go back one, please, thanks. The commissioning arrangements prior to the new care models. So this was when NHS England Specialised commissioned the services. And that was obviously all led by NHS England SpecCom. And the arrangements we had were that CNTW and TUV were managed completely separately, completely separate arrangements. We had 2 contract management boards, 2 quality review meetings, etc., etc. And what that resulted in was a lack of alignment on reporting. So, and often, you know, the 2 providers were sort of, not deliberately, I think, but inadvertently set against each other, because, you know, we'd go into a contract meeting and you know, we'd be told, well, CNTW are doing this, or CNTW would be told TUV are doing this. And, you know, we didn't really get the benefits of working in a more collaborative way. And under those arrangements, the supplier management and case managers were employed by and worked for NHS England. We can have the next slide. So when we set up the new care models back in 2017, we agreed that we didn't want to operate like that. And we wanted, even though not all of the new care models were joint, there was only one of the 3 that was joint, that was adults, we decided we wanted to have a single approach to managing them. And this has evolved into this structure, governance structure that you've got now. So we have the provider collaborative board, the partnership board in the centre there. And as I said, that's chaired by the chief exec of TUV. It includes representatives from both providers. It includes representatives from NHS England, both the national team and the local SpecCom team. And it also includes members of the local integrated care partnerships in the ICS, to make sure we've got that link across to non-specialised services commissioning. That board reports into the 2 FT provider boards, but also reports via the lead contract into NHS England I. And we have a number of subgroups. We have a quality governance group, which my colleague Lisa Quinn chairs, and we have a commissioning group, which I chair. And then there are some implementation groups for each of the specialties. I think what's really important is that we could have, when we had the new care models, we could have set up completely different arrangements for the three new care models as was, but we recognised that that would just be duplication and we wouldn't get the benefits. So that's why we went for a single model. And what we did was we managed to persuade our NHS England colleagues that we didn't need then separate contract management boards, and we didn't need separate quality management boards, because they discharged their responsibilities that they still had at the time of new care models through this structure by being part of this structure. And we also agreed with them that the supplier manager that they employed would work on behalf of the partnership as well. So they were still employed by NHS England, but they worked both to the partnership and to NHS England to try and prepare us for a time when the new care models stopped being pilots, as we all hoped they would, and subsequently now have become provider collaboratives. We can go to the next slide, please. So what would be the key factors I'd want to get over in terms of how we've built this and how, you know, the successes that we've had? And I do believe we have had some successes. Our national colleagues tell us that we're only one of a couple where it really does feel like a true partnership, as we've been developing it for so long now. So I guess that the first factor is relationships. I can't say that enough really, because that's what this is all built on. And the name's in the title really, you know, it's a partnership, it's a collaborative. And, you know, maybe 10 years ago, I would say that the relationship we had with CNTW was very competitive. You know, as two big mental health trusts in the Northeast, we were quite competitive. And, you know, so we've really worked hard to change that round into the partnership that we've got now. I think being clear on the vision, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and making sure that we always come back and we're centred on that. National guidance is helpful, but not always. So there are some places where it's been really helpful because it has been quite prescriptive. And there are some places where it's not been prescriptive and that hasn't been helpful because then, you know, it's left open to interpretation. I think doing strong due diligence, particularly around the commissioning budget, was really important, and being clear about the risk that we were taking on with that commissioning budget was really important. And we had a strong history of recording, which really helped us in that due diligence, because there were the level of accuracy of the data on the different systems, on the trust systems and on NHS England systems, were very similar. So that was really helpful. I think being clear on roles between NHS England in their new strategic commissioning role and ourselves now as a provider collaborative is really important. And sometimes under the new care models, where the budget hadn't transferred, where NHS England was still responsible for managing the contracts, that lack of clarity sometimes did cause not massive problems, but just confusion sometimes in terms of who was doing what. I think having NHS England engaging in the governance arrangements is really important. So they have a seat on the partnership board. They no longer come to the commissioning group or the quality group, because that's not their responsibility as part of strategic commission. And the sharing of staff has been really helpful. So having that supplier manager working with us as a new care model, and actually is now going to transfer over into the provider collaborative. We've just employed him as well, appointed him to a post, will be really helpful. And also the case managers who historically were employed by NHS England are trooping over to our collaborative, to our partnership in October, and are already working in an aligned way with us. And I think my final factor would be doing what's right, even though it may be uncomfortable. So, you know, we were really keen to progress with the provider collaborative, and originally the plan had been that CNTW would be the lead for children and adult eating disorders, and TUV would be the lead provider for adult secure. However, for one reason and another, NHS England were cautious about supporting us to go live with the adult secure one on the 1st of April. And, you know, we had a choice then between us to say, well, do we agree that CNTW will be the lead, even knowing that the optics of that for our organisation may not look good? Or do we, you know, say we'll defer the adult secure one going live? And actually, because we knew this is what we wanted to do, we knew we wanted to make a difference, we knew that we could make a difference because we already had through our new care models, we agreed that CNTW would take the lead on all three, and that would allow us to go live on the 1st of April. Clearly, we had to manage that internally in the organisation, both with our board, but also with our, you know, our operational services. But it was the right thing to do. And we did all go live, and we've been now live for just over a quarter, and, you know, hopefully, touch wood, working well. And that's just open it up to questions there, Lou.
Great, thank you very much, Sharon. That's a great example of how mental health has really led the way on collaborative working. And it sounds like NHSEI have also learned from your guidance too. Please put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll take questions from the floor. Sharon, it was interesting that you talked about, obviously there's a lead provider for contractual processes, obviously, but it really does sound like a partnership. how have you ensured that the smaller providers feel a really valuable part of that collaborative?
So I guess it's really interesting because there aren't any smaller providers that provide specialist mental health trusts in the Northeast and North Cumbria. So we're really unusual, actually, which is part of the reason I think that it's been easier for us than in some areas. I have to say, in other parts of the country, when I listen to some of the complexity that they talk about. So what we have is we do have contracts with smaller providers, but they are not within our footprint, within the footprint of the Northeast and North Cumbria. So those contracts, we have to, the way it works is that actually we contract with the lead providers of their provider collaboratives who then subcontract with them. So it's quite complex in that respect. And because of the direction of travel that NHS England's SpecCom took for years before new care models, from right when they were set up in the Lansley reforms, they were very focused on the two main NHS providers being the most significant providers for the population. So the two mental health, ourselves and CNTW, probably account for 90% of the commissioning budget, 80 to 90%. So we have had discussions about whether we should have, some of those other providers on the board. And I think, it may get to a time when we do that, but we're not there. What we're trying to build more into the board is the engagement of the non-specialised commissioners, so we get that pathway flow better and that understanding across the whole pathway better. So I think that's more of our focus.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Betterley's got a hand up. Sarah, would you like to just briefly say where you're from before you offer your question? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, morning. I'm Sarah Betterley. I'm chair at HPFT, which is the Mental Health Trust in Hertfordshire, and providing service in Bucks and Norfolk and Essex as well. Thank you, Sharon. That was really interesting to hear. And I just thought it'd be helpful to share. So in contrast, or similar in a way, we're also in a collaborative, and you probably know about it, Sharon, if you've been looking at the others. So we're in the East of England Mental Health Collaborative, which we're just about going live. I think we've formally gone live, or we've signed off start of this month. And it's exactly the same 3 services, but a slightly different model, which I think is just interesting to share. So there are 6 partners in the collaborative, and 3 of us each lead on one of the services as lead provider, and then the other 3, and we all, I think all of us provide some of all 6 services. One of the partners provides only 5 of the different services. So it's, I suppose, a lot more complex, but so far seems to work. We're slightly behind you time-wise. But I think it's just interesting to see a different model working, and it has been complex. And I think I totally agree with you. The relationships bit is absolutely key. And some of the challenging stuff, I can see one of the questions in the chat there, the uncomfortable decisions and conflict, we've not quite got there yet. I think there's a lot of anticipation that there will be, and trying really hard to make sure that within our collaboration agreement we've got mechanisms for dealing with those should they arise. And I think that the challenge is that sort of risk share, and recognising that it is complete risk share across the 6 partners, and yet in a scenario where 3 different lead providers and then 3 not lead provider at all. So it will be really interesting to see how it pans out. And I think there's a lot of will, and it is that sort of doing the right thing and knowing the right thing to do. What we have managed to do is build in a review mechanism for end of the first year, just to see whether, if things are going ridiculously out of whack and the finances aren't working, there's an opportunity to have a review conversation, because I think that's where the nervousness is with 6 providers all involved in such a complex arrangement. But just really interesting to hear the comparison.
As I say, our original plan was that we would share the 3 out between the 2, but for a host of other reasons, we decided that actually it was more important to go live than not go live. So we agreed to go with a single, and we may well revisit that at a point in the future. But I mean, you know, we did say that we would maybe revisit it, but for now it was the only way we could go live.
And you've developed your solution to what was obviously a tricky issue. Have you got any other sort of uncomfortable decisions or conflicts that you could share with us, just to give us an example of how, as partners, you've worked through it?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things we've got, and I'm not saying we've got this resolved yet, but we're at least we're talking about it. So for those of you who are LD from LD providers, you'll know that there is the program called the Transforming Care Program, which is basically around reducing the number of inpatient beds for patients, for people with learning disabilities, and making sure that those people can live in the community more without admission into beds. And to support that, there was this thing called the financial transfer agreement, which said that for every patient that was discharged from an inpatient bed and the ward was and the bed was closed, the provider had to give £80,000 over to CCGs to fund the community, who together with local authorities would fund the community provision. So what CNTW did pre-provider collaborative and pre-new care models was they actually physically did give that 80k up, and they took 80k out of their expenditure, handed it over to CCGs, but then put business cases back to CCGs and local authorities on how they may need some of that money back to reinvest in the services, etc. So their business cases were considered by the CCGs along with other business cases for how that money should be spent, and some of that money was reinvested. Tuve took a different approach, which basically said we can't release that money until we actually can, in effect, close the bed and physically reduce the money, because obviously if you've got 8 beds in a unit and you reduce it to 7, you don't actually save 80,000 because you still need the same staffing. So we've got different approaches to that, which we need to resolve, because going forward we still need to reduce beds further, and we need to have a single approach. We can't have this different approach because we're now one partnership. So we've got some ongoing discussions around that, but I am confident that we will get there.
Great, Sharon, thank you. So just on that issue of beds, I understand that you've really successfully reduced your out of area treatments. So did you have to increase those beds, or was it just down to improving flows, or?
We haven't increased, well, in children's services, we haven't increased the beds at all. And that was really about the investment in community services. So it was really interesting. Before the new care model, our CCG colleagues in Durham and Tees had already invested in crisis services for children. And we'd seen the usage of beds just drop off as a consequence of that. So we agreed under our children's new care model at the time that we would go at risk and invest in equivalent services in North Yorkshire and York, where the CCGs hadn't been able to fund that. And what we saw was a massive reduction from that population, equivalent to what we'd seen in Durham and Tees. So we were able to reinvest. I mean, I think we saved over between £2 and £3 million in just children's services. I think the budget was only about 11 or something. And we've reinvested that in the, unfortunately, our provider collaborative no longer includes the North Yorkshire and York population. So that gain has gone to what will be the Humber Coast and Vale provider collaborative. But for the population of North Yorkshire and York, absolutely fantastic. In terms of care close to home, having your family around you, not having to be, because some of the distances for these specialised services are quite a long way from people's homes. So really good news. We have increased beds for adult secure, but that was in line with the National Service Review that expected that to happen anyway. So yeah, we have increased it, but within our existing estate.
Yeah. Okay. So Matt Stringer's put a question in the chat, which is, next steps really. Next steps for your collaborative. Is it about moving the core contract into the collaborative? Is it about really pushing all the commissioning functions in? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly our ambition. Clearly, we haven't got that agreed. We're having discussions with our ICS colleagues about that. I guess within TUV, we already work very closely with our CCGs, and actually we hold the vast majority of the risk around the CCG commissioning budget for Durham and Teesside already, and to a lesser extent for North Yorkshire. So, we're heavily involved in non-specialised commissioning in TUV anyway, but absolutely that would be our ambition. And prior to the ICS publication back in November time, we'd already got agreement with our CCG colleagues to transfer the commissioning responsibility and resource into TUV for the non-specialised services. So we are hopeful that we can do that into across the North East and North Cumbria into the provider collaborative. That's our ambition.
Right. Well, we'll see. We will come back and see you and share some further experience through NHS Providers and NHS Clinical Commissioners. Sharon, thank you so much. That's some great insight and experience. I understand that you're going to stay on and be available for any sort of other questions that people may have after our second case study, because again, I think the richness of this conversation is the breadth of the panel that we have today. So Sharon, thank you very much for that. Okay, I'm going to move us on then to our second case study, which is Carly West-Burnham, Melanie Craig, John Barber and Jim Barker and Melanie Craig. So if you'd all like to put your cameras on, and then I think I'm handing over to Carly, who's just going to talk us through your case study. So welcome, team. Lovely to have you today.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Lou. Do appreciate that introduction. So yes, we are doing a bit of a collective view from Norfolk and Waveney today. So you have got a number of us representing the three acutes within Norfolk and Waveney, but also Melanie, who is the Chief Officer from Norfolk and Waveney CCG. So my job will be to do an initial introduction. We'll give you a bit of background and context as to where Norfolk and Waveney is. Then John will give you a bit of a view as to the challenges, where we are currently and what we are currently facing, and then Melanie will provide some detail around the commissioning perspective as well. So Norfolk and Waveney as a system has been and is facing significant challenges, as I'm sure most systems are. So we have a history of significant challenges for all organisations. So we have three acutes within Norfolk and Waveney, two community providers, one mental health provider, and an overarching commissioner body. In 2018, we commissioned a demand and capacity review, which we did collectively as a system, to identify exactly where our hotspots were and what our constraints were. That identified that as a system we were relatively unsustainable in the longer term. So the do-nothing position resulted in us needing an extra 500 acute beds, 900,000 GP appointments and an additional 75,000 ED attendances by 2023. So obviously we're almost at 2023 now, so we clearly needed to take some action. We recognised that we would not individually, so via our individual organisations, be able to take the level of action that we knew we needed as a system. So for us, this went beyond strategy and a common purpose, and it was around the actual business of how we could make sustainable improvements to quality of care. And for us, this has really been around our patients, but also around our staff.
Hello, Dan Levison speaking.
How could we work better?
Hey Sophie, how are you?
I'm really sorry. If this is not on mute, would you mind going on mute?
Weird emails from Matthias about.
Can we please all make sure we're on mute? We're hearing a telephone conversation at the moment. Apologies, Carly.
Not as exciting as what I'm saying, I know. So for us, it was really around the benefits for our patients, but also our staff, and then looking at that wider operational performance and sustainability from a financial perspective as well, but that has never been the driving factor for us collectively. So for context, we do have a long history of working collaboratively together within Norfolk and Waveney, but we have done that on a more informal basis. The three acutes are very different organisations. So we have 2 district general hospitals, we have 1 tertiary centre. We also have our own individual challenges that we are working with at the moment. In March 2019, we drew up a formal memorandum of understanding, and this was really the start of our more formal collaborative journey. This was between the 3 acute trusts, but also commissioners as well, and it provided us with a framework. So a clear emphasis on integration to improve outcomes, experience for patients. Secondarily, for us, it was around ensuring that staff were provided with high quality, rewarding and worthwhile careers. We absolutely recognise that workforce within Norfolk and Waveney is one of our main constraints, and it's about how we can make sure that collectively we are providing those opportunities to encourage people to come and work for us, but also to retain and to grow our own talent. So we then looked at how, as 3 acutes, we could work collectively closer together, and we developed an acute services integration programme. For us, this was around 2 specific specialties, so urology and ENT, and it was around developing a single integrated service for both of those areas. We have done that. The rationale for doing it was around clearly improving outcomes, so that inherently safer system, improved performance, sustainable workforce, as I've said, but also improved finances as a byproduct. It wasn't necessarily that easy, so we have had a lot of lessons learned from the acute services integration that I know we will touch on and can obviously answer questions around. However, it has also helped us in terms of the development of the relationships between the 3 trusts, and absolutely recognising what was said earlier, relationships are really key to all of this. So we have also been able to strengthen our governance and our clinical oversight via this mechanism. So we have got a really robust governance structure, joint hospital services strategy that we're developing, underpinning our Norfolk and Waveney clinical strategy that's currently in development. We've got a clinical oversight group, which is our MDs, our directors of nursing and our COOs, meeting every month to provide that shared clinical leadership. So building on that, we established a committees in common, so the Norfolk and Waveney Hospital Group Committee in late 2020. And this was to enable the trust to work together to deliver shared objectives. So we have started at the more strategic level. So as I say, it was around specific specialty integration, but also alignment of policies. It's also been around building on COVID. And making sure that we are taking the learning from COVID, so that we are collectively working together to make sure that we've got a joined up systematic approach to elective recovery, but also that we are having the sensible conversations around system investment. So we are currently working collectively towards an electronic patient record business case, and we're doing that through this mechanism as well. Fair to say that there have been challenges. And I will hand over to John, who will articulate some of those challenges and where we are currently.
Thank you, Carly. When I thought about how to pitch this, I thought if I was on the listening to this call, I'd want to understand what went wrong, what would you do differently, and what are you going to do next. So I make no apologies for a random set of points, but I think this is useful to share, and this is something I think we would have all appreciated early in our journey. But there are some common themes, and what is very stark to me is the comments which Sharon said in her presentation: relationships, relationships, relationships. Carly said relationships, and relationships are one of the key threads which you'll hear from the points which are going to follow. So I think you can really if I was going to summarize what I'm now going to say, relationships, the clarity of the rationale and the direction of travel. So making sure that we can land this with all audiences to say, this is why we're doing it. Because sometimes when we talk about the case for change, we do really focus on what's wrong and what do we need to fix, but we don't always articulate what the outcome should be when we do fix them. And that's really important, and I'll absolutely come back to that. So I am going to be fairly brave in the points I'm now going to make, particularly brave, I think, as I know that the chair of my hospital trust is listening to this conversation as well. But so what journey have we been on, and what's worked and what hasn't? Carly's mentioned our committees in common, and it has been a real benefit to us in bringing the trusts together. But the momentum of that has perhaps not been at the pace that some of us would have wanted. But when you build in that relationship conundrum, that's the reason why. And I think anyone, and looking back on us on our journey, perhaps I personally didn't really appreciate the full impact of how important it is to get those relationships right. So the committees in common has been really good, and it's developed itself. So it's not just a small, 3 small committees meeting together in the same room at the same time to discuss the same things. But we've broadened it out to have meetings for all 3 boards from the 3 trusts. We call this our tri-board meeting. That's been really, really important to help us understand the direction that the other trusts are coming from. Because I think it's fair to say when we started this, there was an element of a lack of trust in one another, not quite knowing what the objectives of the other trusts are trying to achieve. And rather futilely, I would say, looking back on it, an element of what is their agenda? You know, are they trying to do something to us? Particularly when you look at the 2 district general hospitals and the Norfolk and Norwich as a tertiary centre. All silly thoughts, but it did worry us. So therefore, building those relationships through that committees in common and the tri-trust board meetings has been really important. So a learning point I would really want to share for anyone on this journey is get people together, get them talking, understand what they're thinking, and have a very clear, agreed rationale of your direction of travel and your landing point. We were certainly given more momentum in February in the publication of the white paper, which talked about the emergence of provider collaboratives. So that really gave some meaning behind our committees in common and reinvigorated us as 3 trusts to say, we've got to do this. Carly really clearly articulated the scale of the challenge we had, a significant wait list, a financial deficit position which cumulatively was scary, and post-COVID, the elective recovery issue that we needed to address. So we knew the challenge, but we had a couple of real opportunities facing us as well. We know that we are going to have hopefully 2, but definitely 1 brand new hospital built in the system. And now we are thinking this is not a replacement James Paget hospital. This is a replacement capacity for the system. So we're not just thinking about this as being our hospital to serve Great Yarmouth and Waveney. It's what can we do to use this capacity to work collaboratively together for the benefit of the patients. So suddenly our ducks started to fall in line. We knew our challenges. We'd got some real opportunities. The white paper published in February gave us a real clear direction that we needed to do this. And also the benefit, and I know Melanie is probably going to speak later on, the benefit of having 1 CCG as opposed to where we were with 5 previously meant we'd got a very strong, clear voice from the commissioners about where we wanted to go as a system. That's been immensely helpful. So the ICS development in Norfolk and Waveney has actually made us think in a number of different areas. It's that horizontal alignment between the 3 trusts, but also that vertical alignment in our localities and places. And we've been trying to do a lot of things at the same time, which one would have thought was crazy, but actually they all dovetail together. So the work we're doing across the 3 trusts and the work that we're doing in each trust with our GP partners, our community partners, all dovetails because we're all focused on one thing, and that's the patient. We developed our case for change and we're constantly trying to refine it because I think our first landing point with our case for change was a rather dull illustration of the challenges we faced. We're now changing that so that the language is really clear to all people. So we need to make that language clear to the people that work in the trust. You know, our best asset is our staff, and we should be bringing them on the journey with us hand in hand. But we also need to articulate what we're doing as 3 trusts with our other providers, community, mental health, GPs, etc. But most importantly, is telling the population what we're doing. Because the minute you say you're bringing 3 hospitals together, you get the initial reactions of, are we going to have 3 ED departments, 3 stroke departments, 3 maternity departments? Are you going to do something which means we have to travel further? So rooting that case for change in a thoroughly evidence-based scenario, but saying this is what it's going to mean for people is really important. And we're constantly trying to align that. So we're in the position now, and I would say we've taken brave steps. I'm not saying brave because the chair of my trust is listening to this, but when you've got 3 chairs, 3 chief executives, and the leadership team saying, by April next year, we will have 1 chair across the hospital group. We will then the following year have 1 chief executive and 1 leadership team. They are brave steps, because that is anxiety you're building into this already. People are really stressed and stretched coming out of COVID. What does this say to our leadership teams? How are people going to feel when we're told you're only going to have potentially 1 medical director? Well, these are the assumptions: 1 medical director, 1 director of strategy. So even us as directors of strategy are feeling anxious about it. But the clarity of the language is really important, because there is enough work in our system to keep us all very, very busy. So it's not going to be like that. But the language is important so that people are at ease in the direction we're going. So we are moving towards the agreement that we're going to have 1 chair by April next year, 1 chief exec and leadership team thereafter. But that brings me on to the point about the clarity of language. Some of the meetings we've had, people have left with a different understanding of what we meant by a single leadership team. Does it just mean an executive function, or is it in effect a single board? And again, our journey has taught me personally that you need to keep reinforcing the outcome from these meetings in terms of what we've agreed. So we've got absolute clarity on that direction of travel and the end game we're all seeking. We also shouldn't underestimate the capacity you need to try and deliver this. This is, when you look at the OD type exercise we have to go through, the HR sort of considerations we need to think about. You can't undertake this form of collaborative alignment just as a part of the day job. There is a lot of capacity needed, and we are lucky to have a CCG that's supporting us, and we've got NHSEI supporting us as well. So we're just about to agree that we're going to have 1 program director to try and lead this. Because in reality, we're talking about forming a single hospital group, which will be in the top 10, 15 in the country, serving a population of 1.1 million people. You can't just do that sort of organically as part of the day job. So comms and engagements is really important, and that's something we're now starting to ramp up, to be really clear to all our audiences about what our case for change is, why we're doing it, and what the outcome is we're seeking. So those relationships are really important, but one of the things which is really key for us is persuading our medical clinical colleagues why we're doing this. And one of the joys of bringing all our ducks in line is the development of a single Norfolk and Waveney clinical strategy, which is clinically led, clinically driven, and actually brings us to the same landing point that we want to do in terms of our overall provider collaborative, because we're not sustainable necessarily on our own, and we're not resolving some of the challenges which Carly set out earlier on our own. So clinically, we're gradually bringing people to the same understanding of where we need to go through a leadership sort of direction and through what the national direction. So bringing together and merging that top down, bottom up to that beautiful sweet spot in the middle is really important. So I will finish on just those 3 themes again, really. It's about relationships, which you've heard throughout all the presentations thus far. So important. And in some ways we chastise ourselves for not moving at the pace we wanted to. But when you think about that relationship journey you have to be on, and let's be really honest, we had a degree of mistrust in our system a few years ago. We don't have that anymore. We have people talking regularly at every level across the 3 trusts and elsewhere. We're talking really openly with our primary care and community colleagues. It all sounds obvious, but that communication is so important. That clarity of language, that articulation of what that landing point is so important, and it's something we are constantly developing and refining, because this is not about us. It's not about us as organizations. It's not about us as individuals. It's about the patients that we need to look after in our system. And at the moment, we have long wait lists. We need to tackle that. So I think we're in a much better place than where we were. We've got a huge amount ahead of us. It is a little bit frightening, but to be honest with you, we're all focused on the patient, and that's the only thing that matters, not our own individual jobs, sovereignty, or anything else. So I'll stop there and pass over to Melanie, who's going to give us a bit of a viewpoint from the commissioners. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Thanks, Carly, as well. Yeah, it's really good to just reflect back on where we were and how far we've come. And I think we've also accelerated a lot more as a result of the experiences we've had during the pandemic. Like, I'm sure many people will connect with that. Just the real operational experiences of the three hospital trust teams working together, that built so much trust. So I think that has given us a big old burst forward. But just a few comments from me, really, as to give the system perspective. I think both the system and the CCG perspective, which are different. So I think certainly, as John said, we were 5 CCGs, and one of the downsides of that was that we just didn't have a strategic approach across our system, Norfolk and Waveney, and we didn't have a line of sight that went beyond the boundaries in the hospitals of each of the 5 CCGs. We've had one management team for 2 years, over 2 years now, for the CCG, and then one governing body formally since April 2020. And I think the commissioners have become increasingly clearer in articulating to the 3 trusts the ask around not whether they become a group or have a committee in common or anything around the governance and decision making, but actually having single clinical services. So we've been much clearer in our ask and expectation. And the reason for that is that we're now looking across one population for the system and seeing significant variations in care and in the offer of care. And that's inevitable because we've got one big teaching hospital in the centre. We've got 2 DGHs. Now, all of those are providing different services, and all 3 have examples of good practice in all of them. So I think that has certainly been a change. But I see the other really key role for the system, for me and for our independent chair during this process is really to support the providers, certainly not to tell them, but to just at times give them space to form, because this is about relationships. It's really sensitive, it's really difficult, and at times as a system colleague or clinical CCG colleague, you can feel part of the extended family when actually it's the immediate family that need to be around the table. So really important to just judge that well and give people space. John's mentioned the case for change, and I mean there are definitely significant benefits for our local population and for our staff within the 3 acute trusts working together, and just keep nudging it forward when it does slip backwards. So I see that has been really key, because it has felt at times like a bit of a game of snakes and ladders. At times we'll just surge forward up this big old ladder and then have something that slides us back down again. We just keep nudging forward and don't give up. I think I am really pleased now that we've got a very clear strategic position in Norfolk and Waveney of the 3 acute trusts in a provider collaborative, and that will strengthen and deepen, as John has just outlined. Actually, even as recently as 3 to 4 years back, the trusts were considering all sorts of other options as a way of tackling the challenges and mitigating the risks, such as vertical integration, particularly where there are strong relationships in James Paget and Queen Elizabeth. That was seen as maybe that was their future. And whilst there certainly are benefits, and it's not one or, but actually a formal collaboration vertically would not have addressed the challenges that we're seeing in terms of staffing and outcomes. So I'm pleased we've got that now. I think that some of the next steps for us really is making sure we think about the integration with the other partners, the community, the out-of-hospital partners, and be interesting to see in the guidance that's published later today, this week, about exactly what's said around the requirements for all NHS trusts around provider collabs, because that's flip-flopped about a little bit. But nevertheless, notwithstanding that, it's really important that whether informally or formally, there is thought around how the out-of-hospital partners are part of that discussion, and also the GPs. So I think whilst I said at the beginning, it's been very important to give the acute trust the space to be part of the conversation when that's relevant, you can add value. I think there also becomes a time where there needs to have much greater visibility on the intent and the ambition, and particularly to involve general practice and GP leaders so that they can support the work of the trusts, and also be part of the ambassadors with some of the ambassadors with the public. So I think that's next, definitely. I mean, I'm excited as well that as an ICS lead, that this gives us the opportunity again to be able to just have a different relationship with the provider collaborative and with the trusts themselves. So talking to a collaborative about developing a new service in response to a specific population need, for example, particularly with the out-of-hospital providers as well. And I think that is an alternative to having, for example, what we've all been used to, having a individual bilateral relationship, CCG, trust, and a forensic review, micromanaging activity. Yeah, I'm excited about the opportunity about talking to the collaborative to, go forth, develop that service. And staff as well. I mean, CCG functions and staff, there is again opportunity to think about existing CCG staff involved in transformation, supporting the provider collaborative to enact that function. So I think probably I'll pause there so there's some time for questions, Lou. Thank you.
So again, please post your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Really interesting, isn't it? How you can bring get provider collaboration when actually you start with a really scary deficit position. I think this has been a great case study. We've heard about particularly focusing on keeping a focus and developing relationships. So I've got one question here from Charles Alexander, which is really, how do you avoid the duplication at sort of system level and at primary care and at place level? I'm not sure if this is probably a bit early around posts in the trust senior management team, but it sounds as if you've got a very transparent approach to how you're going to develop your single team, and you're just getting a bit leaner at the way in which you staff. I don't know if anybody wants to take that particularly. John?
Yeah, I'm happy. I mean, it is early days and we do need to understand what this really means for our leadership team. But, you can see the merits of having, one director of HR across the 3 trusts, can't you? There's a merits of a lot of these single digital. We're forming a single digital team anyway. But, just speaking on sort of behalf of Carly's and Jim and myself as 3 strategy directors, do you need 3 of us to drive a strategy across the system? One would argue possibly not. So, but we have to think about what are the changing roles, because you may need a single director of strategy, but then there are major projects we need to drive through that have that strategic undertone to them. So I think there'll probably be jobs for many people, but things are going to be different. And we have to open our eyes up and say, this is about the patient, not about us as organizations in sovereign identities, or about individuals. And I think we're going on this journey with a very open mind, but we do need to resolve that quite quickly, because there are going to be anxieties. But I think it's a clean sheet of paper we're looking at here.
Thank you. And I recognise your transparency. Thank you for that, and honesty about that. Of course, you're right, though. There are very different roles. This is all about partnerships, coming together, collaboration. And of course, we've got quite a lot to do. The bill and the guidance is really going to allow a lot of permissiveness at place level. So the role of provider collaboratives at place is, again, a huge amount of work to do, but it needs that time and investment. Thank you. You talked about a single, this is a question to the panel, please put your hands up if you want to answer. You talked about focusing on integrated services for urology and ENT. Did any of that require changes in the site at where those services were provided? And did you have to take the public along with you for any of that? Or do you see any issues in the future where you may be changing sites and how you take the public along with you?
Shall I come in on that one? So we haven't. It was The initial concept around the single integrated service was around sustainability. So I think I mentioned that we have workforce issues within Norfolk and Waveney in terms of our ability to recruit and retain. And for us, it was around making sure that we had sustainable workforce to deliver the services that we needed. The route that we took is probably not one which we would look to replicate if we were to do it again. So we looked at a lead provider model. And so Norfolk and Norwich essentially now run the urology service, but we still maintain delivery at the 3 sites. So whilst we have encouraged our consultants to work more flexibly and to work across sites, we haven't fundamentally changed the way in which we deliver the services at the 3 sites. Those conversations are happening now. So recognising the impact of COVID, we weren't perhaps as quick at picking up the transformation conversations as we perhaps needed to have been. However, it is clearly very timely. So we are now starting for urology and ENT to be really clear about actually what should the services look like. That may well mean that we need to look at how we deliver the services and who delivers services where. We're just working through that. Clearly, if there were to be any more fundamental changes, then yes, absolutely, we would consult, but we're obviously not at that stage. We are still maintaining the delivery at the 3 sites.
Okay, thank you. Sharon, I'd like to invite you to just join the sort of panel in general now, because some of these questions may well be relevant. Panel, if I'm not going to ask every one of you every single question, because I don't think we'll have time for that. So do wave at me if you wish to speak. And again, please, to everybody here today, please drop your question in the chat or raise your hand. The level of collaboration, Sarah Betterly saying it sounds fantastic, and you've already talked about sort of single management teams, etc. How are you managing the sort of, do the individual trusts retain their own accountable officer responsibilities? Do you have any plans to sort of streamline that governance in any way? You've talked about joint committees in common, etc. What about individual organisational governance? Is it still back with individual providers at the moment?
Yeah, so as it stands at the moment, we are still clearly 3 sovereign bodies and we retain our governance and our associated responsibilities. I think the process that we're now about to embark upon will clearly be around understanding the governance and the structures that we require. So I think the initial step will be around strengthening our committees in common. So being really clear around the responsibilities, the decision making through that forum, making sure we've got the right membership of the group, so clinical representation as well. I think then as we work through over the course of the next few months, we will absolutely need to be really clear about what we need to do as individual organisations to make sure that we are meeting our own responsibilities, but equally what we can do collectively. So I do think the devil's going to be in the detail there. So we're probably not at the point where we can say we are streamlining things significantly yet, but I know there is clearly an aspiration to make sure that we are doing that.
And clearly you've been able to develop decisions jointly by bringing the decisions makers to that table. Thank you. Anna Davidson, you've got a question. Please, would you say where you're from, Anna, and then ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, I'm chair at the James Paget University Hospital, so I'm part of the Norfolk and Waveney system. So I just thought I'd come in, really, it's not a question, I thought I'd come in on that governance question, because obviously it's one, that does relate very clearly to the 3 individual statutory boards. The decisions that we've come to so far have been that this is not a route to a merger. This is the 3 individual sovereign boards retaining that individual accountability. So in answer to Sarah's question, no, there is no plans at this stage, certainly, for those 3 accountable officers, i.e. the 3 CEOs, if you like, to not have those responsibilities. But I think, the importance at this stage is that whatever structure we put in place, the principle that we have laid out is that the new structure should not cost more or use more resource than the existing one. And I think, that's a good principle to work on, but clearly streamlining, I think, will naturally occur as part of the work as we go forwards. The other point I would make is that whilst we're talking about a single leadership team, and John emphasised the importance of language, we haven't yet defined exactly what that means. And what that could mean, one of the options, is that, for example, one of the medical directors at one of the 3 trusts might lead on a cross Norfolk and Waveney project relating to one particular area of work, and another might lead on another, so that you actually get that shared leadership for different activities. So that again is something that we're looking at to try to ensure. Sorry, I've got my cat in the way. Try and ensure that the whole the whole process feels shared as well as looks shared. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. So really breaking down some of those traditional sort of organisational boundaries, but but still retaining the organisation. So it is all about partnerships. That's been interesting. So Mel, I just wanted to come to you really. You've offered some reflections around the cultural, the commissioners and providers working together. Can you offer any more reflections on how you've managed that provider-commissioner relationship? Is it really possible for provider collaboratives to fairly commission services without commissioner in the mix, or do we need them?
I mean, I think that thanks for the question, Lou. I mean, I think the term commissioning is probably quite misused in the context of the NHS. It's not a dark science or a homogenous thing that people within a commissioning organisational bit with that label do. There are lots of different functions that we enact, and I do see that the part of what CCGs currently do is the transformation. We have transformation teams who work on trying to affect and deliver change, and I think that has to absolutely be done from within the provider collaborative, not from a commissioning body. I see that definitely when the governance is there, the arrangements are then like an alliance type setup is formed. I'm really excited by the prospect of the ICS setting an outcome and then the group of providers determining how they're going to provide it. And that in effect is commissioning. How are you going to commission who does what? And again, although we're today just focused on the 3 acute trusts, there will be, I'm sure, other layers of groupings, whether they're informal, specifically with a task that bring in both voluntary sector, community, mental health, and general practice as a way of them working as a group to decide how to deliver a specific service. So I'm very excited about that, and also as a way of us being able to operate within, albeit waiting for the guidance, the provider selection review instead of procurements. I mean, I think probably most commissioners on the call, if there are any, would agree with me. We don't really like doing procurements. It's not something that many people within a CCG think, yippee, here comes another procurement. But it was the way of, there have been cases where it's been very successful, but it carries so many risks as well. So many risks with procurement. You don't always get what you want. Sometimes you do. So I think that that's again another opportunity for us as well. So I see that the ICS moving forward's key role in this would be to be very, very clear on the outcomes it expects to see and getting that that equality without the variation that we currently see in our trusts.
That's great. Now I'm going to come to every single person who's presented today, so be warned. I would like one top tip from you on what's your top tip to offer to new or emerging provider collaboratives. And Sharon, I'm going to start with you. Are you there, Sharon?
Yeah, it would have to be working on the relationships, because to be frank, if people have to rely on MOUs or subcontracts or any of that, then you've lost the plot, and it's going to break down. So it would, I put it at the top of the factors 3 times. So it would have to be that.
Thank you. Carly?
So clearly I would say relationships, but the other thing I would say would be around the comms and engagement. So actually transparency around where we are in the decision making, even if we have nothing really to say, is much better than not saying anything. So that's from a kind of wider perspective, but also explicitly our NEDs and our governors as well, making sure that everybody is as engaged as they can be.
Great. Thank you very much. John?
Well, I can't use either of the above, so I would absolutely say total clarity of what the landing pad is, and to do that collaboratively using clinical engagement, all staff engagement, just really widen the net of the people that, can I put it emotively, have their fingerprints over this journey. Because if you do it together, there won't be surprises. So I think to really articulate that destination with everybody involved is so important.
Thank you. So Melanie and then Jim, if you have anything further to offer, right? It's always difficult, isn't it, with top tips, because the best ones have already gone.
They really have. Those are all great top tips. I would just add to that, just be bit of a cliche, but be patient, because people will inevitably have different views as to how fast we should go with certain things, how fast we should push things. It'll always be a judgment. But, you know, I guess to try not to get too upset or stressed when, you know, there are differences of opinions around the speed. It doesn't mean we've lost the final goal. We're just, you know, taking that journey slightly differently.
Thank you. Jim, anything from you?
You know, it's really difficult to follow that up. They are clearly the tips really that you need to focus on. It's a common understanding, common language, and really give time for that maturity of the relationship to build.
Right, so we're coming to the end of this session. I hope you found it useful. I, as always, learn so much from these. I think, you know, what we've heard today, it's all about relationships. I think we have to acknowledge that these take time, because if time is taken to develop them properly, they develop and become strong partnerships that actually then can really start to tackle the difficult system challenges. So I think that's a note to our future regulators as they start to set out the bill and the guidance, that these things are going to take time if you want properly strong partnerships built. I think leadership, what we sounded like today, what we've heard today, leadership is going to have to be brave in the decisions they take. We've heard today about talk of moving to a single chair, single leadership teams. You know, there's some brave decisions here about pulling people together, about honesty and transparency. I think focusing on patient experience through the collaborative can measurably enhance the quality. We've heard that particularly from Sharon today. And it is commissioning, I hear, but not as we know it. It's much more about stewardship and supporting transformations and supporting development of provider collaboration. And I think the other learning I wanted to take away today is that you can retain your individual accountability, your individual organisations, because this is about partners working together effectively in a system. So, Jenny, is there anything else we need to say from this joint NHS Providers and NHSCC webinar today?
No, thanks so much, Lou. Thank you for chairing, and thank you to the speakers. The two things I just wanted to flag is if people could take a couple of minutes to complete the survey, that will help us form our autumn plans to make sure that we're supporting you effectively, and there'll be continuous focus on some joint work between NHS Providers and NHS Clinical Commissioners on provider collaboration. Can I also do a very quick plug to another seminar in this series that's coming up on the 22nd of July on governing provider collaboratives. We're just going to post a link to the chat to that event, and we'll also send it to you in the follow-up email. But thank you very much, Lou. It's great to be collaborating together, and thanks to speakers and everybody for coming when we know everyone is so pressurised.
All right. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye.